In this video, I want to talk about version control. So version control is a way for us to record changes to a project over time. And we're going to use the Git flavor of version control in this video. Don't worry if you don't know what that means. We'll talk about that. But what we'll do is we'll set up a new project and we will have it tracked under version control so that we can make changes and record them as we make them. So going through this whole process is going to enable us to do three things. One, it's going to give us a way to better maintain our own code projects. Two, it's going to allow us to collaborate more effectively. Version control is the standard in the field of programming for collaborating. And three, it's going to enable us to start building an online code portfolio. So we'll be able to take some of our code projects, clean them up, and put them onto a cloud platform called GitHub.com to host them and share them. So that'll act as your part of your resume as you start looking for a job in the field of programming. Okay, so what is version control? And I'm pulling up the Git book, which is a free resource. I'll make sure that this is linked in the description that you can check out. So it goes through what is version control, what is Git, and how to use Git. And they have a couple nice diagrams on this page here. So one, you can think about version control as just a way for you to maintain different versions of your project over time. So you get this little timeline of those versions, and you can fly through this history to go back in time or read through past changes in your project. So compared to what we normally do, where we only have one version that's open in Visual Studio, we now have this timeline view that allows us to have a better picture of how our project has changed over time. So this is really helpful for us for organization and backup purposes to be able to look back through the history, but it's also really important for collaborating because version control systems will allow you to share this history with someone else so that you can both be working on it and adding new versions together. And if we fly down through this page, you can kind of see a more complex diagram of how Git works, where you can have different computers that have a shared history, and Git provides ways for us to sync this history across those computers. Okay, so let's build a little bit of a bulleted list of the software that we're going to be using in this video. So one is Git. And Git is the version control system that we're going to be using there. It's not the only one, but it is a really popular one. And this is specifically a command line interface, which means you open up a terminal or command prompt to interact with Git. Then we're going to be using github.com. And this is a social coding platform, a cloud hosting platform. So this will allow you to collaborate with other developers on a project, and will also allow you to back up and host your project on github.com servers. So let's say this is social plus cloud hosting. Oh boy, cannot spell. And then the third thing that we're going to be using here is GitHub Desktop. And this is really just a graphical user interface, or GUI, to Git. So it'll make it easier for us to use Git without having to open up a terminal. It's not the only GUI that you could use for Git. Other ones include Git Kraken, and there is also a GUI that is built into Visual Studio 2019, which you could use. I find that GitHub Desktop is one of the friendliest environments for new folks to version control and recommend it as a good starting place. And then as you become more comfortable, switching to a tool like Git Kraken that gives you more power and is a little bit more complex of a user interface. So these are the things we're going to be using. And to get started, what you want to do is make sure that you go to github.com and sign up for a new account, and then go to desktop.github.com and download GitHub Desktop. And also make sure that you have Visual Studio 2019 installed on your machine to follow along. Okay, so I'll make sure those links are in the description so you can head directly there and get all the stuff you need to set up. What I want to do now is talk about at a high level what version control looks like. So I have just one of my projects under version control pulled up here. The specifics of it don't really matter, but it is a plugin for a game engine that helps integrate collision logic and makes it easier to do collision logic. And it's a JavaScript project, not a C# project. So none of it really matters, except that this is a project that anyone can go check out online. It's part of my GitHub portfolio and projects that I maintain on GitHub. And if we go to it, we can click on the commits here, and we can see a timeline of the project. So this is what I was talking about when we pulled up this diagram to say that there are multiple versions. Each of these commits registers changes to the project over time. So the most recent commit here, if I click on it, will show me what has changed. And specifically, one file has changed here, and I added some tips from a contributor on the project who was talking about how to apply force during collision. That's what this specific change represents. And if I fly back, we can click on other ones and check out what happened in other versions of a commit. So here's one from a contributor that was fixing a warning that was in the project that was broken. So you can see that they removed this line of code, that's what the red means, and added this line of code to the project. So each of these commits is a record of some changes that were introduced to the project. So let's diagram this out. Let's say we're working on our game project in this class, and we set up a project here. I am going to represent the repository, this project, as a series of dots and lines, since it's kind of a common thing to see for representing projects under version control. So each of these dots is one of these recording of changes, a record of changes, or you can think of it as like a snapshot of your project. So for the first one, this might be our initial commit. And what we added to that was just the basic program.cs. And then after working on this project for a little bit, we move into the next commit. So maybe what we were doing here was we were setting up our skeleton of our game class. So when we make this commit, we might add a message that said created game skeleton. And then what we have recorded here would be that we added game.cs, and then maybe we modified program.cs so that it created a game instance and called some kind of like run method like we've done when we're building projects. So each of these commits is a record of the changes, and we can continue to add more. So maybe we continue working on the project, and the next thing we decide to add is a menu class. So we'd add some kind of message here, created reusable menu class. And then what we would see in the list of changes is that we added a menu.cs to our project. And we probably also would have modified our game to integrate that menu. So create some kind of menu in our game and display it to the screen. And as we continue working, we would continue adding these commits, these snapshots of our projects, these records of the changes over time, so that we have this timeline of our project. And all of this together is our repository. So this timeline is our repository, or abbreviated as repo. And one of the neat things about version control that we won't really talk about in this video, but I want you to at least be aware of it, is that you can have multiple timelines. So you can have branches that have different things added to them in their history. So we have one main timeline here, and then there could be a branch off of here to fix a bug. Someone else on the team was fixing a bug in the menu class and working on it on a separate timeline. So that kind of branching becomes really important when you are collaborating. And well, I'll have a video linked about how to use branches for collaborating. Just want to throw it out there as a topic that we won't talk about in this video, but is good to know about. So this diagram here should match up pretty well with what we saw in the browser for this project. So on any of these commits here, these circles in our timeline, there were some changes. So let's see if I can find one here that has some multiple changes in it. Maybe this one. Nope. Let's go back here. Maybe this one. Okay, so this commit has a description. So that is a message that is written by the author of the code to describe what the change is. And then the commit has a list of changed files. So here we can see there are 2 changed files, which looks kind of like when we said we were creating game skeleton, where we added 2 files here. So this here, they're listing the changes. So red means things that have been removed from this file, and green means things that have been added to this file. So we can see a bunch of changes for one of the files, and then a bunch of changes for a test file. And again, the specifics of the code that I'm showing you here don't matter too much. It's more the system that we're kind of looking at. So each of our changes to our project, each of our commits is going to look like this, where we have a description and then there's a registered set of changes that have been applied in that commit. And it would be helpful for us to map out some of the stages of working with files under version control. I know there's a lot of concept here, but it is really important to have the concept in mind before we start working on a project, so that we know what we're doing when we're working on that project. So you can think of a version control project as having a couple of different places where your changes could live. So there is the working directory, or the working tree. And this is like your file, your folder on your computer where you have your project. So in here, there's the program.cs, and there's our game.cs, and our menu.cs, and whatever else we have in our folder on our computer. It's the contents of that folder. And when we're working on our project, we're working in the working directory, which is essentially outside of version control. And so the process of making one of these commits is, I'm going to draw this in kind of a dotted outlined box, the staging area. So the staging area is where we take individual changes and we say, these we're selecting, we're getting them ready to be part of a commit. So maybe I want to add my game and my menu to the staging area. So this is the process of selecting changes And once we have things in our staging area, we can actually take all of the things that have been staged and add them as a commit into our project. So we might have had a couple of commits already in the project, and then when we get things into our local repository, it is like adding another node that has these changes that we have staged recorded in the project. So we can call this the local repo. And local here means our computer. So it's not backed up anywhere. If our computer crashes and the hard drive is unrecoverable, our repository is gone. But the repository is this series of changes that have been recorded on the machine. And I'm going to put a little thing down here to label this. This is commit staged changes. And then what we can do after we actually have the history here is we can push the history or sync the history with a remote repository. And in our case, that remote repository is going to be hosted on GitHub, which is that social cloud hosting platform. So we have our local version of our history, and then we can back it up and sync it to our remote repository. So I'll label this push changes. To remote. So I know it's a lot here, but before we get into our code, let's try and just like put all of this together. So our repository, our repo, is a timeline of commits to a project. And each commit is a registered set of changes that we've made to the project. So when we're working on a project, we are in our working directory, which just means we're outside of version control. We're modifying files, and version control doesn't know about them. So what we need to do is actually stage those changes, so select them, and then commit them so that they end up as a registered set of changes in our local repository. And then if we are working with a cloud platform to back up our project and collaborate on our project, then we can push these local repository changes to a remote repository. And the same process can happen in reverse, where if you're collaborating with others and you've got your local repository, you may want to pull changes down to your local repository from the remote. Okay, enough concepts. Let's put some of this into practice and see how this looks. So what I want to do is open up Visual Studio here, and I want to create a new console project. The same idea applies regardless of whether it's a Blazor project or a console project or a Xamarin project. So we're just going to start with the simplest type of project, which would just be a console project. So I'm going to pick a .NET 5 console application here. And I'm going to make sure that I save it somewhere where I can keep track of it. And I'm going to call this game Git demo. And this should give me a new console application. So I've got my console application, I can run it. It's a normal project. It's not under version control yet. So the first thing we're going to do after this runs here, runs, we're going to put this under version control. And the way that we're going to do that is we're going to do it through GitHub Desktop. So if you open up GitHub Desktop, you should be able to go to File after you log in through GitHub, your GitHub account under GitHub Desktop. Add local repository. And what I want to do is locate where on my computer I just saved that project. So I put this under week 12 here, and I can click on the root folder of my project and select folder. And we can see this, we're getting a message here. This doesn't appear to be a Git repository. Would you like to create one here? The flow may look a little bit different on Windows and Mac here. I think Mac defaults to initializing projects as a Git repository, and Windows machines don't through Visual Studio. For Windows machines, you want to click the Create a New Repository here. And this is setting up some of the information about our repository. So what's the name of our repository? We could put a description in here. Git demo project for intro to programming. It tells us the local path where we are working, and it's really important that this path, if I go ahead and open in a file explorer here, that the path that we're seeing is to this folder. So where I have my SLN, and it's not the path to this folder. We want to make sure that our SLN and all of this is in version control, which I can see here, week 12 game git demo. Then you can optionally initialize your repository with a README. I recommend leaving this checked. This will make it easy for us to turn this into a portfolio project by having a little bit of a description in that README about the project. Git Ignore, it's really important for this one to make sure that you select Visual Studio. Git Ignore configures certain files to be not included in the version history. And then license, this is up to you whether you want to have your project be open source or not. I'm going to leave mine without a license and click Create Repository. So from GitHub Desktop, I can go to Repository, Show in Explorer, or I could go back through Visual Studio to get my project opened up here. And what has happened is a few things have been added. There is now a .git folder in this project, and this is how I know that I initialized my repository next to my SLN and that I didn't initialize it in the wrong place, like down here by my program.cs. So I can quickly tell where I initialized it. And this has information about the project, so you don't want to delete the .git folder. And then there is a Git Attributes and Git Ignore file that have been created. And if I open up Git Ignore by dragging and dropping it into Visual Studio, this is a pretty big file here, which says what files should be excluded from version control history. And we can see things like this pattern here is matching the bin folder where our builds are, where our executable is. So capital B, lowercase b, in is ignored. And that's important to ignore because these things, like our builds, are things that anyone can generate from our source code by hitting play up here or by going into build here. So there's a lot of stuff that's in a project that we don't really want in the version control history because it will end up just taking up space and will clutter the history and make the history harder to read. So we really just want the source code under version control, and the rest of the files we kind of want to ignore. So that's what the .git ignore is doing. The Git attributes allows you to set up some information about like how line endings are handled in different files in your project. You probably will be digging into Git Ignore before you dig into Git Attributes, but those are files that have been generated for us by GitHub Desktop, and you can check them out by dragging them into Visual Studio. And one note here, you may have to, on your machine, enable hidden files and folders, because these start with a dot. Windows maybe or Mac may be hiding them by default. So if you don't see them, make sure that you head into your properties panel up here to make sure that you can see hidden files and folders. So what has happened here, if I flip back to GitHub Desktop, there is a changes panel, which is for showing us any files that have been changed. So this is showing us what's happened in our working directory that we could stage and commit. Right now, there are no changes because we made we just initialized our project without working on the project. The history tab here will show us that timeline of commits where we can click on each of them and see what files were added, removed, and modified. And you can click through here and see that this first commit has just added everything to our project. So each of these files is all green with plus signs next to each line, meaning that each of these was an addition to our project. We can, through this dropdown, change branches. So this is where we could have multiple timelines. We're not going to do that in this video, but that's where you would find it here. And then this button here will allow you to push, pull, and publish your repository. So right now, because we created our repository locally on our machine, if we flip back to our whiteboard, we're at this stage where we have a local repository history, but we have nothing on GitHub. This has not been published. So what we want to do is hit Publish Repository here, which is going to pull up a window here for naming your project, giving it a description, and marking whether or not it's private. If you're working on something in this class under version control, you want to make sure that this is public so that it can be shared with other folks. And same thing if you're working on a portfolio piece, you want to make sure that that is public so that other folks can access it. So as soon as I hit publish, what it's going to do is take the repository that I created on my machine and publish it to GitHub. And if I go to repository, view on GitHub, this will pop open my repository on GitHub. So you can see it's on github.com. It'll be /your account / the name of your repository. And here's my SLN. Here is my folder with program.cs, and I can check any of them out here in the browser to explore what the contents of the files look like. And there is also this README. So when you go to a project, a file called readme.md, this is a markdown file. If that exists, you'll get a preview of it here. So this we can configure and fill out to be kind of our landing page for our project. Okay, so we have a repository set up locally on our machine, and we have published it to GitHub so that we can view it and view it on github.com and back it up to the remote servers on github.com. So let's go through the process of making a few commits. So we're going to make changes to our working directory, we're going to stage them, and then we're going to add them to a commit, and then we will publish that to github.com, and we'll be able to see it in our browser. So if I flip back to version control or to Visual Studio here, let's make a really simple change. Instead of saying hello world here, let's say hello version control, and let's do a console.read key so that my console window stays open after this message prints out. So we've just modified the program.cs. We didn't add new classes. We just modified these two lines. And actually you can see over here where Visual Studio is highlighting that there have been changes to those two lines. And if I flip back to GitHub Desktop here, now my Changes tab is showing me that there are things that have happened in my working directory that have yet to be added to my local repository. So we made some changes to the working directory here, and now we need to go through the process of selecting the changes to stage and then committing them into our local repository. So what you want to do here, it's really simple when there's only one file. We basically just check that file to say we're staging this specific file. You can actually get more specific. You can say like, oh, I just want this line from this file, this removal committed, or I want these two lines. For starting out, let's just make sure we're selecting the whole file here. And then we add a description, a title and a description for our commit. So here we could say changed the hello world message. And if we are describing something that requires more information, we'll put a short title up here, and then we could put more information in the description if we needed it. In this one, there's not much to describe, so I'm just going to leave it as a title, and then we're going to hit commit. And as soon as we hit commit, this is now added to our local history. So we have our initial commit here, and we have changed the hello world message commit here, and each one lists the changes that have happened in that snapshot. So here, the changes that are in this commit are that we removed this line and we added these 2 lines. Now, it's really important to realize that what we've just done, this is just in our local repository. If we want any of this to show up on GitHub, we have to actively push it to GitHub. So if I go back to my browser and refresh my page here, there's still only 1 commit in the remote repository. So what I need to do is click the push origin button here to take that commit that I just made and push it to GitHub, push it to our remote repository, so that now we can see that change reflected here. So I can click on commits here. I can see changed hello world and see the differences. We removed this line, added these 2 lines. So now that change has been recorded in our remote repository in addition to our local repository. So let's make some more changes. We'll go through this process of working in our working directory, staging, committing, and then pushing to remote. So let's create a game class. So I'm going to go project, add class. I'm going to call it game. And much like we've done in previous videos, we just want to create a method that we'll call when we want the game to run, and it'll be a public method. And so this could, let's do console write line, welcome to the game. And let's do a console write line, press any key to exit, and then a console read key at the bottom to keep the window open. So we've set up a method here. So what we can do in our program is, rather than do any printing and reading here, we can say, let's create a new game instance, and then we can have that game run. So I've made a small change. I'm testing that it works. We can see welcome to the game, press any key to exit. And I now want to, now that I know that that small change is working, I want to go ahead and commit it. So if I flip back to GitHub Desktop, I can see that there are now 2 files that have been changed. And I could potentially select just one of them and commit it. And I can also, like we saw, select individual lines and commit those lines. So what you want to think about when you're making commits is that you want to leave your project in a working state with each commit. So here, I think what I'm going to do, I think that these 2 files, these changes that we made, I'm going to commit them together as one change and call this, let's say, created skeleton game class with run method. And then commit it. And now it's in our history here. So we can see the 3 commits we've got. Whoops. And I think I accidentally dragged and dropped. And so I got into a new mode here. Which, let's see, is there a way to exit this? What I'm just gonna do, I'm gonna close GitHub Desktop and pop it open again. If you drag and drop commits in GitHub Desktop, it allows you to kind of reorder the history, but I don't want to be stuck in that mode. And I don't remember the hotkey to exit that. Okay, so I'm back in regular mode here. I can see my history, click on the changes, see my changes here. And then importantly, I want to make sure that I push to get any of this to show up in GitHub. So here I only have 2 commits, and then if I push, I should have 3 commits now, and we can see that latest one of creating a skeleton of the game class with a run method. All right, let's keep going. So let's make a few more changes. So we're chugging along on our project, and maybe what we do is we create a player class. We say we know we're going to need to store the player's name somewhere, so we create a public string name, and this will be a capital N for a property here. So I'm just creating a property that is publicly readable, but only privately settable. And let's create a constructor. And it's just a simple constructor that takes in a string name and sets it to our property, initializing the player. Maybe we're also working on it and we decide let's add a menu class, because we're definitely going to create a menu at some point. And maybe we're also kind of working on multiple things at once, and we think about heading back to our game class, and we can, let's say we remember that we could bring in system.console and remove the console here. And we decide that we're also going to initialize the player. So we can say, what is your name? Read line. And then we will create a current player using that name. And then we could print out a message like, let's get started, and then insert the current player dot name in here. And let's test all of that, see that it's working. So we get our welcome to the game, what's your name? And then let's get started, Mike, press any key to exit. So obviously not the full game, but we've got a number of changes here. And so what I want to do with this is kind of show you how to untangle some of the changes and make multiple commits from these changes. So generally the process that you want to go through is when you're working on your project, make a small feature, and then go ahead, commit it, push it in your project so that you get everything registered in your local repository and your remote repository. But sometimes what happens is, like what I just showed you, is you're working on a few things at once, and you've got a bunch of features working, and you kind of want to turn those into multiple commits. And with GitHub Desktop, it makes it easy to select individual files and then lines from those files. So here, in terms of the features, we have a menu class, we have a player class, and then we have a couple of changes that were in our game class. So one was that we refactored things so that we brought in the system console namespace. So we didn't have to say console here and here and here. And then we also added in our player. So what I might do is start making multiple commits here. So here, this was create a placeholder menu class and commit it. And then here I could say created player class that stores the player's name. And then back in my game class, I'm going to take the individual lines. So I'm going to say the refactoring that we did was one feature where I brought in this namespace. I changed this line from console write line to write line. And then I changed these two lines to these two lines. And I could say refactored game to bring in system.console namespace. And after I commit that, now I'm only seeing the changes related to the player here. And I can say added player initialization to our game, or to the game. And now if I look at my history, I have a whole stream of commits that are individual features that we worked on in the game here. And remember, these are all local to my machine. So if my computer got nuked, all of this would go away. And the only thing that would be on the remote repository is those initial 3 that we pushed. So after I make those changes, I want to click push origin here to push these to GitHub. And now we should see 7 commits in our history up here on GitHub. And all of those are backed up now. So when you're working on version control, you're always going to be going through this process of making changes in your working directory, staging them, committing them to your local repository, and pushing them to your remote repository. And if you're working on a project as a solo developer, you may not be doing a lot of pulling from GitHub. We'll leave that for talking about in the future. And you may not be doing branching yet, where you have multiple timelines. Again, I'll have a video linked if you're curious about that and how to use Git for collaborating, at least in the context of intro to programming. This is a good starting point for us for getting projects under version control and getting them into GitHub so we can start building our code portfolio. So you'll go through this process that we just went through. As you keep working on a project, you keep making small changes and then trying to commit those small changes as these snapshots inside of GitHub Desktop. You will only have to do the initialization process that we did at the beginning once for your project, and then the rest is just going through this committing process and pushing process that we went through. So I think the last thing that I want to show you in this video is we've got a project on our machine here. Everything has been committed and pushed to the remote repository, which means that if I go ahead, I'm going to close Visual Studio here, and I am going to go to repository, remove, and also move this to my recycling bin. So that means that my project has now been removed from my week 12 folder here and removed from version control. But it is not removed from github.com. So when you have a project that's on GitHub, it might be your project or it might be someone else's project that you want to check out, you can clone the project. So you can bring this remote repository down to your machine so that you have a local version of it. And you can do that if you click the download button here. There is an open with GitHub Desktop that will take you to the GUI, the graphical user interface. We can also do this straight from here. So we can say file, clone repository, and then we can look through our repositories. So after this loads here, we should see a listing of our repositories. And this is taking a while. There we go. So now we could look for Git game, Git demo. Oh, I've got too many that are closely named from doing these tutorials. So we have this project, so we could click through it here, or you can also grab your URL from your project and paste it in here, and then choose where you want to clone it. So I want to put this back in my teaching folder under week 12. Go ahead and clone it. So this has pulled down the project history. So I've got all 7 of those commits that we made previously. And if I go ahead and show it in Explorer, I can see that this has now been cloned back into my week 12 folder. And if I double click on the SLN here, this will open the project back up. And we can see all of our files here are as we left them, and I can hit play. And we should see our project build. So this process allowed us to maintain our project in version control, which gave us this timeline, which was really useful. Also had the side effect of, because we had our repository backed up to github.com, we could delete it from our computer and re-clone it whenever we needed that project again. All right, so I will leave this, I'm gonna leave off the video here. A couple of things that if you want to dig in deeper, you can. You can use actually Visual Studio to manage the version control. So you can, in the latest version of Visual Studio 2019, you'll have a Git changes and a Git repository window that you can pop open. Let's pop both of these open here. So the Git repository window, I can see my list of my commits. And if I double click on them over here, I can see details of what has changed in any of those commits. And I also, if I go back and let's say in our game class, made a change here, like I changed the title, and I go to my Git changes window, I will now see that file listed as something that has changed. If I double click on it, it'll show me the difference between those two files, and I can add a message here. And I can select things like we were doing in Visual Studio to have them staged, and then commit them and push. And if you're logged into GitHub, that will go through the process of, to your account, pushing that to GitHub here. So I can see my latest commit added. So you can do all the process that we've been talking about in Visual Studio. I think that the tools that are built into Visual Studio are getting better and better, but I do find that personally I use Gitkraken for maintaining my version control in a project, and I find that interface to be more powerful and easier to use than the tools built into Visual Studio. But you have that option. So I'll have a video linked in the description that goes through and introduces you to the flow in Visual Studio 2019 for managing Git. And I'll also have some videos linked that go through more foundational topics in version control, like how to deal with conflicts when you have multiple commits that have changed a file and Git cannot merge them. How do you deal with those conflicts? And also, how do you deal with branching workflows and collaborating? So I'll have some more information linked if you want to dig into that. But you should have, at this point, the knowledge to be able to set up a repository and manage that repository, the version control, manage your version control system through GitHub Desktop. So bring this into your workflow and start building out your coding portfolio.